This is Miss Knight. I'm going to be reading Huts on the Beach, Chapter 3 of Lord of the Flies. As I read this chapter, my students should be aware of how they see the boys starting to revert to more savage, animal-type beings. And note those with sticky notes in your book. Jack was bent double. He was down like a sprinter, his nose only a few inches from the humid earth. The tree trunks and the creepers that festooned them lost themselves in a green dusk 30 feet above him, and all about was the undergrowth. There was only the faintest indication of a trail here, a cracked twig and what might be the impression of one side of a hoof. He lowered his chin and stared at traces as though he would force them to speak to him. Then, dog-like, uncomfortably on all fours, yet unheeding his discomfort, he stole forward 5 yards and stopped. Here was a loop of creeper with a tendril pendant from a node. The tendril was polished on the underside. Pigs, passing through the loop, brushed it with their bristly hide. Jack crouched with his face a few inches away from this clue, then started forward into the semi-darkness of the undergrowth. His sandy hair, considerably longer than it had been when they dropped in, was lighter now, and its bare back was a mass of dark freckles and peeling sunburn. A sharpened stick, about 5 feet long, trailed from his right hand, and except for a pair of tattered shorts held up by his knife belt, he was naked. He closed his eyes, raised his head, and breathed in gently with flared nostrils, assessing the current of warm air for information. The forest, and he, was very still. At length, he let out his breath in a long sigh and opened his eyes. They were bright blue, eyes that in this frustration seemed bolting and nearly mad. He passed his tongue across dry lips and scanned the uncommunicative forest. Then again he stole forward and cast this way and that over the ground. So we already see Jack has very much reverted to an animalistic hunter in the time they've been here. And his hair is longer, so they've been here for several days, probably weeks. But we see that Jack is dog-like. He's on all fours. His eyes are bolting and mad. He's using his sense of smell to try and hunt and track these pigs. So he's developed much more of an animal tendency. The silence of the forest was more oppressive than the heat, and at this hour of the day there was not even the whine of insects. Only when Jack himself roused a gaudy bird from a primitive nest of sticks was the silence shattered, and echoes set ringing by a harsh cry that seemed to come out of the abyss of ages. Jack himself shrank at this cry with a hiss of indrawn breath, and for a minute became less a hunter than a furtive thing, ape-like among the tangle of trees. So again, he's hissing, he's described as ape-like, very animalistic. Then the frustration claimed him again, and he searched the ground avidly. By the trunk of a vast tree that grew pale flowers on its gray bark, he checked, closed his eyes, and once more drew in the warm air. And this time his breath came short. There was even a passing pallor in his face, and then the surge of blood again. He passed like a shadow under the darkness of the tree and crouched, looking down at the trodden ground on his feet. The droppings were warm. They lay piled among turned earth. They were olive green, smooth, and they steamed a little. Jack lifted his head and stared at the inscrutable masses of creeper that lay across the trail. Then he raised his spear and sneaked forward. Beyond the creeper, the trail joined a pig run that was wide enough and trodden enough to be a path. The ground was hardened by accustomed tread, and as Jack rose to his full height, he heard something moving on it. He swung back his right arm and hurled the spear with all his strength. From the pig run came the quick, hard patter of hoofs, a castanet sound, seductive, maddening, the promise of meat. He rushed out of the undergrowth and snatched up his spear. The pattering of pig trotters died away in the distance. Jack stood there, streaming with sweat, streaked with brown earth, stained by all the vicissitudes of the day's hunting. Swearing, he turned off the trail and pushed his way through until the forest opened a little, and instead of bald trunks supporting a dark roof, there were light, gray trunks and crowns of feathery palm. Beyond these was the glitter of the sea, and he could hear voices. Ralph was standing by a contraption of palm trees and leaves, a rude shelter that faced the lagoon and seemed very near to falling down. He did not notice when Jack spoke. "Got any water?" Ralph looked up, frowning, from the complication of leaves. He did not notice Jack even when he saw him. "I said, have you got any water? I'm thirsty." Jack withdrew his attention from the shelter and realized Jack with a start. "Oh, hello. Water? There, by that tree. Ought to be some left." Jack took up a coconut shell that brimmed with fresh water from among a group that was arranged in the shade and drank. The water splashed over his chin and neck and chest. He breathed noisily when he had finished. "Needed that." Simon spoke from inside the shelter. "Up a bit." Ralph turned to the shelter and lifted a branch with a whole tiling of leaves. The leaves came apart and fluttered down. Simon's contrite face appeared in the hole. "Sorry." Ralph surveyed the wreck with distaste. Never get it done. He flung himself down at Jack's feet. Simon remained, looking out of the hole in the shelter. Once down, Ralph explained, "Been working for days now, and look!" 2 shelters were in position, but shaky. This one was a ruin. "And they keep running off. You remember the meeting? How everyone was going to work hard until the shelters were finished? Except me and my hunters, except the hunters. Well, the little ones are—" He gesticulated, sought for a word. "They're hopeless. The older ones aren't much better. Do you see? All day I've been working with Simon. No one else. They're off bathing or eating or playing." Simon poked his head out carefully. "You're chief. You tell him off." Ralph lay flat and looked up at the palm trees in the sky. "Meetings. Don't we love meetings? Every day, twice a day, we talk." He got on one elbow. "I bet if I blew the conch this minute, they'd come running. Then it would be, very solemn, and someone would say we ought to build a jet, or a submarine, or a TV set. When the meeting was over, they'd work for 5 minutes, and then they'd wander off or go hunting." So we see Ralph getting frustrated with leadership in this scene. He has the charisma. People like him. People want to do what he says, but he doesn't have any authority to back it up. They're not afraid of consequences if they just leave and don't help him. Nor should they be, because he's not enacting any consequences. And it's like I had you guys looking in Chapter 2 for moments where the kids want to hang on to the adult world and want to mimic the adult world, and how they fail at doing that. Because they're children. They just don't have the self-control and the self-discipline to commit to a task fully. They're more concerned with instant gratification and doing what they want to do than their larger needs. Jack flushed. "We want meat." "Well, we haven't got any. And we want shelters. Besides, the rest of your hunters came back hours ago. They've been swimming." "I went on," said Jack. "I let them go. I had to go on. He tried to convey the compulsion to track down and kill that was swallowing him up. "I went on. I thought by myself." The madness came into his eyes again. "I thought I might kill." "But you didn't." "I thought I might." Some hidden passion vibrated in Ralph's voice. "But you haven't yet." His invitation might have passed as casual, were it not for the undertone. "You wouldn't care to help with the shelters, I suppose." "We want meat, and we don't get it." Now the antagonism is audible. "But I shall, next time. I've got to get a barb on the spear. We wounded a pig, and the spear fell out. If we could only make barbs. We need shelters." Suddenly Jack shouted in rage. "Are you accusing—" "All I'm saying is we've worked dashed hard. That's all." They were both red in the face, and found looking at each other difficult. Ralph rolled on his stomach and began to play with the grass. "If it rains like when we dropped in, we'll need shelters all right. And another thing. We need shelters because of the—" He paused for a moment, and they both pushed their anger away. Then he went on with the safe, changed subject. "You've noticed, haven't you?" Jack put down his spear and squatted. "Noticed what?" "Well, they're frightened." He rolled over and peered into Jack's fierce, dirty face. "I mean the way things are. They dream. You can hear 'em. Have you been awake at night?" Jack shook his head. "They talk and scream, the little ones. Even some of the others. As if this wasn't a good island." Astonished by the interruption, they looked up at Simon's serious face. "As if," said Simon, the beastie or the snake thing was real. Remember?" The 2 older boys flinched when they heard the shameful syllable. Snakes were not mentioned now. Were not mentionable. "As if this wasn't a good island," said Ralph slowly. "Yes, that's right." So this calls back 2 specific events. One is in the last chapter, Fire on the Mountain. We had the first death on the island of the boy with the mulberry birthmark. and remember that he was the boy who was concerned about the snake thing. He wanted to know what Ralph was going to do about the beastie, the snake thing on the island. So now mentioning that makes them think of this boy who they kind of are all pretending never existed, but of course they all know what really happened. So that's an uncomfortable topic and is scaring the little boys. Additionally, I talked in my video for Chapter 2 about how Ralph frequently insists that this is a good island, and what does that word good mean? It's such a vague word. It can mean any sorts of things, from morally good to bountiful to just pleasant to be on, and it's worth considering, especially since this book is so much about moral good and moral evil. How could an island be morally good? Definitely keep that in mind, because he's going to say that a lot more as the book goes on. Jack sat up and stretched out his legs. They're batty. Crackers. Remember when we went exploring? They grinned at each other, remembering the glamour of the first day. Ralph went on. So we need shelters as a sort of home. That's right. Jack drew up his legs, clasped his knees, and frowned in an effort to attain clarity. All the same, in the forest, I mean, when you're hunting, not when you're getting fruit, of course, but when you're on your own. He paused for a moment, not sure if Ralph would take him seriously. Go on. If you're hunting, sometimes you catch yourself feeling as if... He flushed suddenly. There's nothing in it, of course, just a feeling. But you can feel as if you're not hunting, but being hunted. As if something's behind you, all the time, in the jungle. They were silent again. Simon intent, Ralph incredulous, and faintly indignant. Their reactions to what Jack's saying here is really indicative of their characters and what their characters symbolize. We talked about archetypes, and if Ralph is the archetype of a leader, the head of a society, his civility, his rationalism will not allow him to believe in any sort of supernatural beast or feeling such as the one that Jack is describing. It's too emotional, it's too unscientific, it's too not rational for him to indulge it. And so he's incredulous and he's indignant and he doesn't like it, and it makes him upset and angry. Simon, on the other hand, is intent. He's listening hard and thinking hard about what Jack is saying. We'll see more from Simon at the end of this chapter and consider why he might be a little bit more willing to hear what Jack's saying in this scene. Ralph says, well, I don't know. Jack leapt to his feet and spoke very quickly. That's how you can feel in the forest. Of course there's nothing in it. Only... He took a few rapid steps towards the beach, then came back. Only I know how they feel. See? That's all. The best thing we can do is get ourselves rescued. Jack had to think for a moment before he could remember what rescue was. This is a really ominous line. Jack can't remember what rescue means or why it's important. We're going to see that spread to the other boys as we continue on the book. This forgetfulness of society and hope, and this idea that anything exists outside of the island. Rescue. Yes, of course. All the same, I'd like to catch a pig first. He snatched up his spear and dashed it into the ground. The opaque, mad look came into his eyes again. Ralph looked at him critically through his tangle of fair hair. So long as you hunters remember the fire. You and your fire. The two boys trotted down the beach, and turning at the water's edge, looked back at the pink mountain. The trickle of smoke sketched a chalky line up the solid blue of the sky, wavering high and faded. Ralph frowned. I wonder how far off you could see that. Miles. We don't make enough smoke. The bottom part of the trickle, as though conscious of their gaze, thickened to a creamy blur which crept up the feeble column. They've put on green branches, muttered Ralph. I wonder... He screwed up his eyes and swung round to search the horizon. So he's looking for a ship. He's thinking maybe they saw a ship. They put on green branches to make themselves more visible. Got it! Jack shouted so loudly that Ralph jumped. What? Where? Is it a ship? But Jack was pointing to the high declivities that led down from the mountain to the flatter part of the island. Of course, they'll lie up there. They must when the sun's too hot. Ralph gazed bewildered at his rapt face. They get up high up and in the shade, resting during the heat like cows at home. I thought you saw a ship. We could steal up on one, paint our faces so they wouldn't see, perhaps surround them, and then... Indignation took away Ralph's control. I was talking about smoke. Don't you want to be rescued? All you can talk about is pig, pig, pig. But we want meat. And I work all day with nothing but Simon, and you come back and don't even notice the huts. I was working too. But you like it, shouted Ralph. You want to hunt. Well, They faced each other on the bright beach, astonished at the rub of feeling. Ralph looked away first, pretending interest in a group of little ones on the sand. From beyond the platform came the shouting of the hunters in the swimming pool. At the end of the platform, Piggy was lying flat, looking down into the brilliant water. People don't help much. He wanted to explain how people were never quite what you thought they were. Simon, he helps. He pointed at the shelters. All the rest rushed off. He's done as much as I have, only Simon's always about. Ralph started back to the shelters with Jack by his side. I'll do a bit for you, muttered Jack, before I have a bath. Don't bother. But when they reached the shelters, Simon was not to be seen. Ralph put his head in the hole, withdrew it, and turned to Jack. He's buzzed off. Got fed up, said Jack, and gone for a bath. Ralph frowned. He's queer. He's funny. Jack nodded, as much for the sake of agreeing as anything, and by tacit consent they left the shelter and went towards the bathing pool. And then, said Jack, when I've had a bath and something to eat, I'll just trek over to the other side of the mountain and see if I can see any traces. Coming? But the sun's nearly set. I might have time. They walked along, two continents of experience and feeling, unable to communicate. If only I could get a pig. I'll come back and go on with the shelter. They looked at each other, baffled, in love and hate. All the warm salt water of the bathing pool and the shouting and splashing and laughing were only just sufficient to bring them together again. Simon was not in the bathing pool as they had expected. When the other two had trotted down the beach to look back at the mountain, he had followed them for a few yards and then stopped. He had stood frowning down at a pile of sand on the beach where somebody had been trying to build a little house or hut. Then he turned his back on this and walked into the forest with an air of purpose. He was a small, skinny boy, his chin pointed, and his eyes so bright they had deceived Ralph into thinking him delightfully gay and wicked. All right, I'm going to stop there because Simon's eyes are really important for a couple reasons. For one, this is a moment where we see the three boys from the first day who explored the mountain in Chapter 1 together again, now a few days or weeks later. And they're different, right? Jack and Ralph are fighting. Ralph thought that Simon would be really gay and wicked, which I think in British 1950s language means he would be mischievous and fun-loving, which are not what either of those words really mean now. And he doesn't feel that way now, and he definitely doesn't feel feelings of friendship towards Jack. So these three boys had this instant friendship bond that has now been broken as they kind of get to know each other better, which really reflects back to Ralph's quote that people were never quite what you thought they were. Additionally, Simon's eyes are really important. We talk about Piggy's glasses and how they're really important as they symbolize technology of civilization and they symbolize intelligence, but we don't talk as much about Simon and his vision. His eyes are described as bright. He sees things as they really are, and we haven't seen much of that because we haven't heard from him, but we will. And keep in mind that he has this deeper understanding of the world, and he sees it in a more true way than the other boys. So you would do wise as readers to listen to what he has to say. The coarse mop of black hair was long and swung down, almost concealing a low, broad forehead. He wore the remains of shorts, and his feet were bare like Jack's. Always darkish in color, Simon was burned by the sun to a deep tan that glistened with sweat. He picked his way up the scar, past the great rock where Ralph had climbed the first morning, then turned off to his right among the trees. He walked with an accustomed tread through the acres of fruit trees, where the least energetic could find an easy, if unsatisfying, meal. Flower and fruit grew together on the same tree, and everywhere was the scent of ripeness and the booming of a billion bees at pasture. Here the little ones who had run after him caught up with him. They talked, cried out unintelligibly, lugged him towards the trees. Then, amid the roar of bees in the afternoon sunlight, Simon found for them fruit they could not reach, pulled off the choicest from up in the foliage, passed them back down to the endless outstretched hands. When he had satisfied them, he paused and looked around. The little ones watched him unscrutably over double handfuls of ripe fruit. This moment of Simon pulling down the fruit from trees for the little ones, it seems, by the way they drag him to the trees, that this is something that he's done before, that it's something that they expect of him. And it's really it's a caring gesture. He doesn't have to do that. He doesn't have to take care of these little kids. But he does. And it also makes me think two things. One, it makes me think back to when he stood up for Piggy in the last chapter. Jack was yelling that Piggy hadn't helped them at all with the fire, and Simon said, well, yes, he did. You used his glasses to start the fire. He contributed that way. So you can tell he kind of likes to stand up for the underdog. Additionally, it makes me think of almost like a saint or even Jesus. It makes me picture this picture of Jesus in a children's Bible that I probably saw growing up, where he was seated and like the little kids were coming up to say hi to him and talk to him, and he was being really patient with them, which is a New Testament story in the Bible. But this idea of like this quiet, wise person inviting the little children and respecting them and giving them what they need makes him seem like a saintly kind of figure, which is important and relevant. Simon turned away from them and went where the just perceptible path led him. Soon high jungle closed in. Tall trunks bore unexpected pale flowers all the way up to the dark canopy where life went on clamorously. The air here was dark too, and the creepers dropped their ropes like the rigging of foundered ships. His feet left prints in the soft soil, and the creepers shivered throughout their lengths when he bumped them. He came at last to a place where more sunshine fell. Since they had not far to go for light, the creepers had woven a great mat that hung at the side of an open space in the jungle. For here a patch of rock came close to the surface and would not allow more than little plants and ferns to grow. The whole space was walled with dark, aromatic bushes, and was a bowl of heat and light. A great tree, fallen across one corner, leaned against the trees that still stood, and a rapid climber flaunted red and yellow sprays right to the top. Simon paused. He looked over his shoulder, as Jack had done, at the close ways behind him, and glanced swiftly round to confirm that he was utterly alone. For a moment his movements were almost furtive. Then he bent down and wormed his way into the center of the mat. The creepers and the bushes were so close that he left his sweat on them, and they pulled together behind him. When he was secure in the middle, he was in a little cabin screened off from the open place by a few leaves. He squatted down, parted the leaves, and looked out into the clearing. Nothing moved but a pair of gaudy butterflies that danced around each other in the hot air. Holding his breath, he cocked a critical ear at the sounds of the island. Everything was advancing towards the evening was advancing towards the island. The sounds of the bright, fantastic birds, the bee sounds, even the crying of the gulls that were returning to their roosts among the square rocks were fainter. The deep sea breaking miles away on the reef made an undertone less perceptible than cessation of the blood. Simon dropped the screen of leaves back into place. The slope of the bars of honey-colored sunlight decreased. They slid up the bushes, passed over green candle-like buds, moved up towards the canopy, and darkness thickened under the trees. With the fading of light, the riotous colors died, and the heat and urgency cooled away. The candle buds stirred. Their green sepals drew back a little bit, and white tips of the flowers rose delicately to meet the open air. Now the sunlight had lifted clear of the open space and withdrawn from the sky. Darkness poured out, submerging the ways between the trees till they were dim and strange as the bottom of the sea. The candle buds opened their wide white flowers, glimmering under the light that prickled down from the first stars. Their scent spilled out into the air and took possession of the island. All right, so kind of weird. We see Simon choose to go off to himself to the spot that he apparently knows about and has been to before. And he kind of crawls in and hides behind these vines and branches and pieces of nature. And we see him set apart here physically from the other boys. He's physically seeking out solitude. What he does here is unclear. Is he meditating? Is he napping? Is he just hanging out? We don't really know, but it's clear that he does need to remove himself from human contact. And he's already removed, right? Ralph said earlier in this chapter that he's queer, he's funny, he just like doesn't quite seem to be one of the other boys. And he's also removed from his fainting spells. We know that he faints sometimes. And some critics of the novel think that he has epilepsy, which causes him to faint and have seizures that would look like more of a fainting spell. So we see him as really different from the other boys, and what archetype he is we're going to be exploring as we keep on reading.